Without further ado, please join me in welcoming my colleague from Behavioral Sciences, Antonio Soriales.
Okay, as is generally my way, I have a tendency to over-prepare, so I'm going to ask you to sort of throw something at me when I've got about 5 minutes left. Okay? I want to thank you everyone for joining me. The title of my talk is Using Clicker Technology to Teach Biology-Based Material in a Developmental Psychology class. One of the challenges that we have as faculty, among the many challenges, is to teach science-based material to our students who very often come into our classrooms with no history of any science at all. Or very little expertise, very little understanding of the sciences. And so the challenge is how to teach them this very difficult, this very challenging material. Challenging material so they can learn it. And so what this talk is about is a study that makes use of clicker technology. It's the evaluation of an exercise that was developed that makes use of this clicker technology to actually teach the course material. And where I want to start off this discussion is talking about the basis for the exercise. Now, before we talk about the clickers and how that comes into play, the foundation for the exercise is based on an area of learning theory and behavior analysis called equivalence-based instruction. And an equivalence class is a group of physically disparate stimuli. An equivalence class is defined as a group of physically disparate stimuli that are all interchangeable for one another. So if we see this little cartoon over here coming out of the New Yorker, while we've got 3 representations, they all are, and none of them look like each other, they all basically mean the same thing. And as the little caption on there sort of illustrates, basically we're all trying the same thing. We're trying to say the same thing. So what an equivalence class does is it makes items that are otherwise have no perceptual similarity whatsoever, it makes them interchangeable for one another. And so those procedures used to establish equivalence classes were the basis for the exercise that I developed in the class. Now I want to talk about a little bit more about how we establish equivalence class by giving another example. Here we have the quick photo of this little fellow who we all can identify as a dog. But I want to point out the obvious for a second that the image in no way resembles the words as printed on the screen. Yet the two are functionally interchangeable for one another. That the image is the same as the word. If we extend this to the word perro as spoken. So there's dog in Spanish. So now we've got 3 representations of the same thing, and none of them bear any perceptual similarity at all. The first is an image, the second is a word as printed on the screen, and the third is auditory. Yet they are all interchangeable for each other. Same example here with this little fellow down there. We've got the picture of a cat, the word cat, and then the word gato in Spanish. All three of these stimuli are interchangeable for each other. In other words, they're all members of equivalence classes. They're all members of equivalence classes. So perceptually disparate, they are interchangeable for each other. And each of these classes is made up of 3 stimuli. Stimuli A being the picture, stimuli B being the word as printed, and then being stimulus C being the word as spoken in a given language, in this case, Spanish. Symbolically, it would be represented like this. Class 1, made up of 3 stimuli, stimulus A1, B1, and C1, and then class 2 at the bottom, A2, B2, and C2. So that would be the symbolic representation of the equivalence classes. A problem that we deal with every day, though, an alien comes down from outer space, and we've got to teach them that these things go together, sort of thing, right? We know this, right, by virtue of our experience, but if you had to teach this material to somebody, if you had to teach them that that picture on the left means the same thing as dog in the middle, means the same thing as perro on the right, how exactly do we establish these relationships? How do we teach these associations? How do we establish this concept? And we do that by making use of equivalence class or equivalence class formation procedures, which again is the basis for the exercise I did in my class. So I would begin by training first one stimuli to another, so in this case A to B, for both the dog and the cat. Now, how exactly would this training work? Well, there are several procedures in equivalence class formation that are used, several procedures. But the one I use is something called a stimulus discrimination procedure, and it would look literally something like this. At the top of the screen, it's often computer administered, but it doesn't have to be. But at the top of the screen, one of the stimuli from the classes would be presented. The stimuli at the top of the screen would be a dog. In this case, it would be referred to as the sample. The subject would then make a response, the student would make a response, and then two other stimuli would appear at the bottom of the screen. These two other stimuli are comparisons. And so the job of the subject is to decide which of these samples goes with the comparison. They go together, they're interchangeable. So of course, if the subject selected dog, that would be followed by positive feedback, and then the subject presented cat. That would be followed by negative feedback. And then the same thing for our other example with our cat over here. The cat would be serving as the sample, and then the two comparisons would come up. If they selected dog, that would be followed by negative feedback, and if they selected cat, that would be met by positive feedback. A game. And this game would continue with feedback until they met an established criteria. Now, what the criteria is up to you. 100% correct on 10 consecutive trials, for example, is a fairly common criteria. Okay. And this would continue for 100% feedback until they hit that criteria, and then the feedback level would be reduced. So we'd go from 100% to 75 to 25 to 0%. So in other words, they establish or demonstrate these relationships without any feedback whatsoever. So this is the basis of the exercise that I did in class. And so once these relationships have been established, we then move on to the next relationship, dog to perro, cat to gato. And again, the conditional discriminations would structurally be the same, but they look different. We'd start with the word as printed at the top of the screen, and then the two words, you'd actually hear them in your headset, the two words as spoken. And then again, the subject would select one or the other. So like perro, positive feedback, gato as negative feedback, cat as the sample, and then the two words as spoken as the comparison. Okay. And so, if we did this exhaustively, however, these are all the relationships we'd have to train. I think there are 12 of them. It's a lot. It's a lot. But what equivalence-based learning tells us is that actually we're not required to teach all the relationships. That we can teach a few of the relationships. And I've got them highlighted here. This is a procedure known as many-to-one training. And if we train these relationships, all the other relationships are derived. That the subject should be able to respond to all those other relationships correctly only with training of these minimal relationships. One last way to look at it, again, symbolically, if we train A to B and then we train C to B, all these other relationships should be derived. Okay, so it doesn't require us to train all 12 relationships. And this is a good thing because then we can bring this activity into the classroom, where it might take a couple of hours. To do all of the training inside the classroom, it can take 45, 50 minutes, which it actually did during the exercise. And one last way to look at it is, again, what we're training are these relations indicated by the green arrows. They're referred to as baseline relations, and then all the other relations indicated by the red arrows are referred to as emergent relations. So all we need to do is train these 4 baseline relations, and these are the conditional discriminations that we've established. There they are at the top of the screen. A1B1, A2B2, C1B1, C2B2, and then all these other relationships would emerge following the training of the relationships at the top. Symmetry is just a reversal of the baseline relationship. And then transitivity, you'll notice, presents stimuli that had never been presented together. So dog, in the presence of the word perro, that relationship had never been seen before, yet the subject will still know that those two things are interchangeable. So again, how do we bring this into the classroom? Well, I'm teaching a developmental psychology course, and there's a lot of biology-based material in it. And among the material they have to learn is material like this, stages of prenatal development. And at its simplest, we've got 9 pieces of information for the subject, for the student to learn. Now go home and read it, look at it in the text, study it, figure it out. But if we look a little more closely, we see what we actually have here are three distinct equivalence classes, each represented by a different color over here. And each class, 1, 2, and 3, is made up of 3 stimuli. The first stimuli is the name of the period of development. The second stimuli in the second column is when that stage of development occurs, and then the third column indicates the defining characteristic of the stage. So what we have here are 3 equivalence classes with 3 members. So the issue is, can we use those equivalence procedures? Can we use those equivalence procedures to teach this material? And so that's what the study was. The study examined, can we use that equivalence class formation training procedures that I just described to teach this material in the classroom? So instead of doing a traditional lecture, using a traditional lecture, I used the equivalence class procedure that I described a moment ago to teach this material. And specifically what we trained was, we began by training the name to when it occurred, and then we went to the defining characteristic to when it occurred. Those were the conditional discriminations that we established. That was the training. Okay. And again, conditional discriminations looked a little like this, just like they did before. So we had the name of the period, we'd have the name of the period as the sample, and then the when as the 2 comparisons, and then they would have to select which one. Increased cell division, the defining characteristic as the sample, and then when the period occurred as the comparisons. And then one would occasion positive feedback and the other would not. Okay. Now traditionally in equivalence-based learning, traditionally in equivalence-based learning, these procedures are done alone at a computer sitting at a desk. And what I wanted to avoid was something like this. What I wanted to avoid were students sitting alone at a desk, sort of confused, frustrated, or asleep, sort of, while doing the exercise. So I wanted to see if there was a way that I could do this while having everybody work together. What I wanted to avoid was basically this, a room full of people each sitting at their own computer doing their own thing, and sort of just being lost in their own world of confusion. Can we do this as a group? And the answer is yes. That's where the clicker technology came into play. And clicker technology is a remarkable bit of technology where each student is given one of these little remote controls, and it allows the professor to do real-time surveys of the classroom while it's going on. And so that's what I did. I gave each student their own clicker, and then I presented the students with the conditional discriminations as a group. And they responded as a group to those conditional discrimination problems that I described a minute ago. So instead of having those frustrated faces, I had groups of students that, they're all happy. They're all doing the problems basically at the same time. They were also at the same time given the clicker technology. When I provided feedback using the clicker technology, the feedback that was provided was on a group basis. So individual subjects, I couldn't provide immediate feedback for an individual student for how they did. So I gave them this sort of follow-along sheet, as I had a more clever name for it. I called it simply a tally sheet where they can follow along their progress. And so I showed them how to score this and what their answers were and whether or not their answers were correct or incorrect. And what I have here are examples of the actual conditional discriminations that we used during the study. So we started with this, trial number 1, so they'd write trial number 1 on the tally sheet, and then they'd write journal period as the sample on the tally sheet again. Okay, so there's your sample, and then now here are your 3 comparisons, A, B, and C. And using the clicker, they now entered a response. Now the only person who knows the response was the subject. Only the student knew what response they entered. After everybody's entered their response, and I know this, the software would tell me how many people responded. It would tell me when everybody responded. This figure came up. And this figure illustrates the percentage of students in the class that responded to each of the comparison options. So 33% responded to A, 33% responded to B, 33% responded to C. You'll also notice that the percentage of the this one bar that's in green, which indicates the correct response. Okay. Trial 2. Fetal period, they noted trial 2 on the tally sheet, they noted fetal period, here are the comparisons, and again, they entered their response using the Clicker, when everybody entered the response, we ended up with a group tally right here. 80% selected option B, but the correct option, of course, was C. Okay. Another trial, embryonic period. Now we're getting a little bit better. 80% of the class now selected the correct comparison. Okay? And this continued. I continued this process until the entire class, as a group, met 95% correct, got 95% correct on at least 10 consecutive trials. So this procedure continued until that criteria was met. And so very quickly, the design I used was a pre and post test design. The post-test, the pre and post-test, of course, measured their knowledge of the material before the intervention. The control group was the traditional lecture, and the experimental group, used this clicker intervention. Notice during the clicker intervention, by the way, I did not say a word. I said, we're going to get some questions on the board. You've got to try to answer them using the clickers. And that was it. That was it. The pre-test, they had these, each of the 9 elements that we described, each of the 9 elements was placed on an index card. They were randomly presented to the student, and the student was asked to sort them into groups that they thought they went together. So which of these elements went together? If they sorted them properly, they would have sorted them like this. But what we have here are data. Okay, what we have here on the data. And for the control group, this was the lecture-only group. Only 2 of 23 students actually organized the material correctly prior to the lecture, which is a little bit disappointing because nobody did the reading. But when we go to the experimental group, it means the same thing. Only 1 of the 32 students knew the material prior to coming to class, which was good because that tells me, 1, my lecture, they're going to learn something in my lecture, and 2, I'll be able to evaluate the clicker. Very quickly, the control group, after the lecture, 5 of the 23 students learned the material, but after the experimental group, the clickers group, realize I didn't say a word during the lecture. We've got 85% here. The number is 27 of 35 who learned the material using the clicker exercise in class. Now, I know I went through this very quickly, but the long and the short of it is that clicker technology is an effective way to present the material based on the equivalence class instruction or equivalence-based learning that I described earlier in this study. Thank you.
Thank you.